welcomes you all this evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. I've prepared a special collection of night shift stories for you to enjoy. So, sit back, relax, and let the darkness take over as we dive into some chilling tales that are sure to send a shiver down your spine. Story: The Watcher of the Bridge. I had worked the graveyard shift for as long as I could remember. My job was simple: keeping an eye on the security cameras, ensuring that the overnight traffic passed smoothly, and making sure the area around the bridge remained undisturbed. The town I lived in was quiet and peaceful, nestled between dense woods and hills. The bridge I watched over was old, built nearly a century ago, and, though it had been renovated a few times, there was still a certain charm to it. The traffic was light, mostly trucks hauling timber, and the occasional commuter or lost tourist trying to navigate the winding roads of the mountains. I was the night shift security guard for a small, independent company that had recently expanded into monitoring remote locations. The bridge was one of those places. A vital connection between the east and west sides of the county, but only used by those who had no choice or no better way to get through. There wasn't much for tourists here, but the beauty of the place, with its sweeping vistas and dense forests, was enough to make anyone stop for a moment. Tonight was no different. The clock ticked slowly as I sat in the dimly lit security office, a single lamp illuminating the desk and the array of monitors in front of me. The town had long since gone to bed, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rattle of the window as the wind picked up outside. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to shake off the drowsiness, when I saw something odd. On one of the cameras, positioned at the far end of the bridge, a figure appeared, barely visible at first, but quickly becoming clearer as I focused in. It was a man, walking slowly along the bridge. His gait was strange, jerky, almost like he was struggling to keep his balance. I frowned, wondering if he had broken down or needed help. The road was desolate, and the bridge, despite its sturdy appearance, had always been a spot for strange occurrences. The whole area had a reputation for being haunted, something locals never seemed to talk about directly but hinted at in stories and whispers. Still, I wasn't one to buy into ghost tales. The wind picked up again, and I heard the sound of it howling outside. I clicked the intercom button on my desk. "Hey, you okay over there?" I called out, my voice crackling through the speakers in the bridge's security gatehouse. There was no response. I pressed the button again, a little more firmly this time. Still, nothing. I sighed and leaned back in my chair, muttering under my breath about the late night wanderers who probably thought this was a shortcut. I knew the area well enough to know there wasn't much beyond the bridge, just woods, and some winding roads that led nowhere important. But curiosity tugged at me, and I found myself pulling my coat on and grabbing the flashlight from the desk. The bridge was a few hundred yards away. I had made this trek countless times, checking for damage, debris, and ensuring the lights were functioning. But tonight, something felt off. The air was unusually thick with fog, and the wind had taken on an almost unnatural bite. My footsteps echoed off the steel beams as I approached, and I squinted into the gloom, trying to spot the figure I had seen on the cameras. At first, I couldn't see him. The fog was thick now, almost blinding, and the bridge's high arches cast long shadows across the path. I called out again, my voice stronger this time. End quote. "Hey, you there," end quote. There was no answer. Just then, a faint movement caught my eye. The man was now standing at the far end of the bridge, facing away from me. His clothes were strange, old-fashioned, almost like something out of a history book. A long overcoat, a worn hat, and shoes that were too polished for this kind of remote area. I frowned, thinking how odd it was for someone to be walking around in such attire at this hour. The fog made everything seem surreal, as if the world were distorting before my very eyes. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with the growing tension. "What are you doing out here?" The man did not respond. In fact, he didn't even move. He stood there, as if frozen in place. I approached slowly, keeping my distance but edging closer, my heartbeat quickening with each step. My flashlight beam illuminated the path in front of me, but I didn't dare shine it directly at him yet. Something about his stillness unnerved me. When I was about 30 feet away, I stopped, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I called out again, "Sir, are you okay? You need help?" Suddenly, the man turned to face me. His face, pale, gaunt, and expressionless, sent a chill crawling up my spine. There were no signs of life in his eyes, just an emptiness, like staring into the void. The strange part was his eyes, they didn't reflect the light from my flashlight. It was as if the light passed through them and out the other side. Before I could speak, the man turned away again and began walking slowly toward the center of the bridge. His steps were unnaturally smooth, gliding more than walking. I froze, unsure of what to do. I had never felt anything like this before, an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was in the presence of something not entirely human. I should have turned back, I knew that. But instead, I followed him. Something about this was pulling me in, making me question everything I had ever known about this place. As I crossed the bridge behind him, I could hear the faintest whisper on the wind, something unintelligible but filled with a sense of urgency. I reached the center of the bridge, where the man had stopped. He was looking out over the edge, his back to me. I called out one last time, "What do you want?" The man didn't respond. Instead, he stepped forward, vanishing into the fog like smoke. One moment, he was there. The next, gone. I ran to the spot where he had been, frantically searching for any sign of his presence. The fog had thickened, and it was as if the world itself had swallowed him whole. My head was spinning. I couldn't comprehend what had just happened. I reached for my radio to call in, but when I switched it on, all I heard was static. That night, I returned to the security office in a daze. I reviewed the footage from the cameras. It was clear, at first. The man had been walking across the bridge, just as I had seen. But then, at a certain point, the footage flickered, and he simply wasn't there anymore. It was as if he had never been. The rest of the night was uneventful. When I returned to work the next night, I tried to tell my colleagues about the strange figure. They listened, but none of them seemed convinced. "It's just the fog playing tricks on you," one of them said dismissively. But I knew what I had seen. And I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still out there, watching, waiting. The bridge had always felt like a place of stillness, a place where time had somehow forgotten itself, but now I wondered if it was haunted by more than just memories. The following weeks passed in a haze. I couldn't stop thinking about the man on the bridge. His strange appearance, and his disappearance. I would catch glimpses of him in the corner of my eye, on the cameras, in the shadows by the railings. But each time I would investigate, there would be nothing there. Just the empty road and the fog. I'd learned from the locals that the bridge had once been the site of a tragedy. Years ago, a Man had died in a car crash, and it was said that his ghost never left. But this wasn't just a story. This felt like something far older. Something older than the bridge itself. I still don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else. Entirely. But as long as I work here, I feel like it's only a matter of time before the figure returns. And when it does, I'll be there again, waiting. And maybe, just maybe, I'll get an answer to the question that haunts me: what does he want? Story: The Silent Watcher. It was my first job out of college, working the night shift at a small but bustling convenience store near a busy intersection. The kind of place where the neon sign buzzed and flickered in the dead of night. The aisles were brightly lit, and the only sounds were the low hum of refrigerators and the occasional beeping of the register. Most nights were uneventful, and I spent my time stocking shelves, checking the security monitors, and trying not to doze off on the counter. The night in question started like any other. I walked into the store at 10 p.m. for my shift, greeted by the soft buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. It was a chilly October evening, and the wind outside was howling. The store had a handful of regulars who stopped by during late hours for snacks or gas, but nothing that raised any red flags. I was the only one working, as usual. We didn't get too many late-night customers, especially on a Wednesday. Around 1 a.m., I started feeling that strange unease that would creep up my spine, something I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't the usual emptiness of the night that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but something else, a sensation that I was being watched. I brushed it off as just the paranoia that comes with being alone in a quiet store at such an odd hour. A few minutes later, the bell above the door jingled, and I looked up. A man had entered the store. He was wearing a long, dark coat, his face shadowed by the brim of a wide-brimmed hat. He moved slowly, deliberately, his gaze flicking around the store in a way that felt unnervingly deliberate. I couldn't help but feel that there was something off about him, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. He didn't head straight for the snacks or the drinks, like most people. Instead, he walked past the aisles, slowly pacing the store as though he was inspecting every corner. I told myself it was nothing, just a quirky late-night shopper. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But the unease in my stomach only grew. He approached the counter after what felt like an eternity, and with a deep, unsettling breath, he placed a single item on the counter, a pack of gum. His voice was soft, almost inaudible. As he spoke, "Nice night, isn't it?" I nodded stiffly, not wanting to engage in conversation. "Yeah, it's pretty quiet tonight," I said, trying to sound friendly but distant. He chuckled softly. It wasn't a friendly laugh. It was dark, low, like someone who knew a secret they weren't willing to share. The bell jingled again as he moved to leave, but before he stepped outside, he turned back to look at me. "You're alone tonight, aren't you?" he asked, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. My heart skipped a beat. "Yeah, I'm the only one here," I said, forcing a smile. He nodded, his gaze lingering on me for just a second too long before he stepped outside and disappeared into the night. I didn't know why, but that brief interaction unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I quickly locked the door behind him, even though the store wasn't closing for hours. I checked the security cameras, but they showed nothing out of the ordinary. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next night, he came back. This time, I was ready. I had already decided that if he came in again, I'd be polite but firm. I didn't want any trouble. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. He didn't belong in my small corner of the world. At 1:30 a.m., like clockwork, the door jingled again. The same man. Same coat, same hat, but this time, he didn't go to the counter right away. Instead, he stood in the middle of the store. Looking around, his gaze sweeping over the aisles as though he was searching for something, or someone. My heart began to race. I couldn't help it. Something was off about this. This time, I didn't want to wait. I quickly grabbed the phone from behind the counter and dialed the emergency number for the local police. I explained the situation, telling them that there was a man who had been coming to the store at strange hours, and I felt uncomfortable. The officer on the other end told me to stay calm and keep my distance. He reassured me that they'd be sending someone to check things out, but it could take a few minutes. I hung up, watching the man from behind the counter. I could feel his eyes on me even though he wasn't facing me directly. It was like he knew exactly where I was. Then, without warning, he started walking towards me. I froze. My mind raced as I thought about what to do. Should I grab the pepper spray under the counter? Should I try to run to the back? The door was locked, but the back exit was just a few steps away. Before I could decide, he spoke. "I'm not here for trouble," he said softly, his eyes glinting in the dim light of the store. "I just wanted to talk." I tried to muster a calm response, but my voice betrayed me. "I told you last time, I'm not interested. You need to leave." But he didn't. Instead, he took another step closer, and for the first time, I noticed something even more unsettling. His hands were trembling. It was then that I realized, he wasn't here to hurt me. He was here because he needed help. But he didn't know how to ask for it. "I'm sorry," he whispered. I don't know who else to talk to. I feel like I'm being watched too." Before I could respond, the bell above the door jingled again. I glanced up, and this time it was the police, 2 officers in uniform, their hands on their holsters as they entered. The man turned toward them, his face suddenly changing. The fear I had seen in his eyes vanished, replaced with a cold emptiness. He stepped backward, eyes narrowing. Without another word, he turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the night before the officers could even approach him. They asked me a few questions, but the whole thing felt surreal. The man was gone, and I never saw him again. The officers didn't seem concerned. They'd had reports of strange behavior in the area, but nothing to worry about. They left after a few minutes, and I was left standing there, shaking, not knowing whether I was relieved or disturbed. Over the next few days, I tried to forget about the encounter, but it lingered in my mind. Was he truly just someone who needed help, or had he been planning something worse? I couldn't shake the feeling that the man had known something I didn't. 2 weeks passed, and then one night, as I was leaving work, I saw something strange in the parking lot. The car was still there, his car. The same one he had driven when he stalked me. But when I walked past it, I saw the man standing by the dumpster, staring at me. This time, there was no hesitation. I didn't feel scared. I didn't feel threatened. I simply felt sad. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible in the quiet night. "I just needed to know if you were real." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to walk away, but something in me stopped. "I'm real," I finally said. "And you need help." He nodded silently, his eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. Then, just like that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. I never saw him again after that. But sometimes, when I walk past that same parking lot late at night, I still feel a chill run down my spine. Not from fear, but from the strange sense that the world is much darker and more complicated than we realize. And I wonder, was he a man on the edge or something else entirely? Story whispers in the walls. I had never been particularly superstitious. I worked the night shift at a small, family-owned diner on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the same customers came in every night, where the booths were worn but the coffee was always hot, and the lights never seemed to turn off. It was a steady job, one I'd been doing for the past 2 years while attending college. The night shift was usually quiet, uneventful, and easy. I liked it that way. But things changed one particular night in early autumn. I was scheduled for a long shift. From midnight to 8 a.m., with only one other employee, Sarah, a waitress who'd been working there since before I started. She was an older woman, kind but with a mysterious edge to her. She never talked much about her past, and I respected her need for privacy. But there was something about her demeanor, quiet, always watching, that made me uneasy. Sometimes. That night, the diner was eerily quiet. We had a couple of late-night truckers come in, some regulars who would eat their fill before heading back out on the long highway, but for the most part, it was just me and Sarah, the occasional hum of the fridge or the clink of silverware the only sounds breaking the stillness. We had finished cleaning the kitchen and prepping for the morning rush when something odd happened. I was in the back, wiping down the counters and organizing the dishes when I heard a soft shuffling sound from the kitchen. At first, I thought it was just the sound of Sarah walking around, maybe organizing some things. But then I heard it again, this time, a faint scraping sound, like something had been dragged across the floor. I walked toward the kitchen door, my heart racing slightly. It was late, and my mind was starting to play tricks on me. The kitchen was dimly lit, and the sound seemed to be coming from the far end, near the freezer. "Sarah?" I called softly. "Everything okay?" There was no answer. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open, my footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. I didn't expect to see anything, but when I stepped inside, my breath caught in my throat. The kitchen was completely empty. There was no sign of Sarah. And yet the sound was still there. A scraping noise, like nails on a chalkboard, coming from the far corner of the room. I froze in place, trying to steady my breath. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For a moment, there was only silence. But something was off. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was in the room with me. I turned to leave, but just as I reached the door, I heard a soft whisper, almost like a sigh. I spun around, but there was no one there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I quickly stepped out of the kitchen and back into the main dining area. I found Sarah standing by the coffee machine, sipping a cup of coffee. Her expression was neutral, but there was something in her eyes, something I couldn't quite place. "Everything all right?" she asked, her voice calm but piercing. "Yeah, just, thought I heard something in the kitchen," I replied, my voice shaky. "Guess I was hearing things." She gave me a knowing look. "You'll get used to it," she said softly. Her words sent a chill down my spine, but before I could respond, the bell on the door jingled, signaling the arrival of another customer. Later that night, around 3 a.m., the diner was as quiet as ever. Sarah was at the counter, scribbling in a notebook, while I was restocking the napkin holders. That's when the door opened, and a man walked in. He was older, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a long coat and a wide-brimmed hat. His face was hidden in shadow, and his steps were slow, deliberate, almost like he was moving with some unseen weight. He didn't seem to be in any hurry. In fact, he almost seemed to float, his feet barely touching the floor as he crossed the diner. I froze when I saw him. Something about the way he moved, so unnatural, so still, made my stomach churn. I couldn't put my finger on it, but I didn't like the way he made the air around him feel colder. The man sat at one of the booths near the window, facing the door but not looking at us. His hands rested on the table, palms down, fingers spread wide. "Can I help you?" I asked, forcing myself to approach. He didn't respond immediately, but his eyes shifted toward me. His gaze was piercing, unsettling, and it felt like he could see straight through me. His lips barely moved when he spoke, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm waiting for someone," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. I glanced at Sarah, who was still sitting at the counter, her face unreadable. I could see that she was watching the man carefully, but she didn't seem alarmed. I felt a knot form in my stomach as I turned back to the old man. "Are you sure?" "It's getting pretty late," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer me. Instead, he looked back toward the door, his gaze fixed as if he were expecting someone to walk through it at any moment. His expression was unreadable, and yet it was clear that he wasn't really seeing anything in front of him. His eyes were distant, as though he were waiting for something, or someone, that would never come. "Can I get you anything to drink?" I offered, my voice trembling slightly. The man slowly shook his head, still not acknowledging me. The coldness in the air seemed to grow more intense, and I could hear the faintest whispers coming from the corners of the room. Suddenly, the man stood up, and as he did, the temperature in the diner dropped sharply. I felt a wave of cold wash over me, and I shivered involuntarily. The man didn't walk toward the door, though. Instead, he turned and walked toward the back of the diner, toward the kitchen. "Sir, you can't go back there," I called out, but he didn't seem to hear me. I rushed after him, but by the time I reached the kitchen door, he was already gone. The room was empty. When I turned back toward the dining area, the man was gone. The door to the diner had closed softly, but no one had walked through it. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the empty booth where he had been sitting, my heart pounding in my chest. As the night wore on, I tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. The man's disappearance made no sense, and the whispers, those whispers, kept echoing in my mind. But it wasn't until just before the end of my shift that something truly terrifying happened. I was cleaning up the counter when I heard the distinct sound of footsteps coming from the back storage area. I glanced at Sarah, but she was still in the kitchen, cleaning up. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe one of the delivery guys had come back early to grab something. But as the footsteps grew louder, I realized there was no one else in the building. I called out, but no one answered. My voice sounded hollow in the empty space. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen door. I slowly walked over to it, my heart racing in my chest. As I reached for the door handle, I heard a soft voice whisper my name, as though it was coming from inside the walls. "Leah." I froze. The voice wasn't Sarah's. It was something deeper, older, filled with a hollow sadness. I threw open the door, but the kitchen was completely empty. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and I heard the whispers again, but this time, they were coming from everywhere, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The very air around me felt thick with something I couldn't understand. And then I saw it, a figure, standing just inside the kitchen. It was the old man. But this time, he was no longer wearing the long coat or the hat. He was dressed in tattered clothes, his face twisted in a grimace. His eyes were hollow, as if he were a hollow shell of the man I'd seen earlier. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only watch as he reached out toward me, his cold, bony hand stretching across the room. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The lights came back on, and the whispering stopped. I didn't wait to find out what had just happened. I grabbed my things, rushed out the door, and locked it behind me. As I walked to my car, the coldness lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't really left. Hey everyone, Mort here. Thanks so much for tuning in and listening to tonight's stories. I really hope you enjoyed them. If you did, it would mean a lot to me if you could drop a like and hit that subscribe button. And if you made it all the way to the end and aren't subscribed yet, well, that'd be awesome too. I put out new videos every week, so I hope you'll stick around. A huge thanks to my amazing members and patrons. You guys rock, and your names are right there on the screen. If you like this video, I think you'll enjoy this one too, so why not give it a watch? Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.